We'll be continuing our study of the history and geography of the biblical story. I want to thank Rich for filling in for me last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I think it was, if my math is mathing. But he's not able to be here with us this morning. He's not feeling well, so maybe he'll catch my thank you online, but I'll certainly send him another one as well beyond the other activities going on for today. Hopefully those who are not able to be with us can continue that way. So we are going to, again, dive back into a bit of the survey of the Gospels story where Rich left off, and then we'll move into the book of Acts, trying to pay close attention to the people, places, and the context of the geography side to set the stage for the history. Because the book of Acts, as you've just studied in your Wednesday evening Bible study, and looking into the New Testament letters, kind of create our framework going forward. But before we get into that study, let's go ahead and bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time that we share together, particularly as it allows us an opportunity to study your word deeply, to pay attention to the history that surrounds the Bible story. Help us as students to learn well. Help us as disciples to grow well. Grant us wisdom and give us opportunity to serve in the kingdom and in the world. Forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so I'm pretty sure that this is about where Rich left off. I guess it was 2 weeks ago, kind of paying attention to where we were and where we are. And so this particular outline of the geography side is key to one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, and it shows us visually a couple of these key places. I want to make a quick point as we kind of walk through some of this. It is very important at times to be aware of where the story is taking place regarding Jesus and the other participants in the gospel narratives, because that will help us understand very quickly who he might be talking to when we're not getting all the details. Each of the ways the biblical authors write, they have an audience in mind and a method to relay that information. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of them tend to pay attention to different things. Matthew's audience is uniquely Jewish in his approach to give them information. In that, the time stamping, the method by which he tells what time it is Jewish. The terminology he uses to describe the locations and places, he leans into the either historical or the current alternate Jewish name for some of these places. That's important because it's going to help us frame how we read the text. And so you catch that. And that also appears in the geography, because the various communities around Jerusalem are, as they are in any other place, often segregated by the family connections. This is not arbitrary forced segregation that does happen in antiquity, and it does happen in Israel and in Jerusalem, but it's one that's very similar to, you look at a homesteading context or a family farm context, everybody is semi-related when they all kind of work and farm together in small farming communities. The sections outside of Jerusalem function that way post-return, post-captivity, especially considering the inclusion of other groupings of people who have moved in after the Roman rise to power in this area. So Matthew's writing will alert us to that based on how he addresses or identifies things. It's also apparent when we read Mark and Luke, because the perspective shifts. So Mark shifts the angle and everything shifts Roman. Also, Mark skips a lot of the storytelling details. And if you wanted to think about it again for ease of remembrance, Mark always gets right down to business. If there's a shortest, most efficient way to tell us the story, Mark employs that methodology. And you'll see that play out when you read the Gospels in a synchronized way, where you're reading both of them at the same time. Luke, remember Luke's our big He's writing two big stories. He is detail concerned. He writes from the perspective of one who is trying to tell his most excellent lover of God, Theophilus. That's what that word means. It's possibly a full first name or a name, but it's also simply just someone giving a nickname to either cover that person's identity or to say, this is to every lover of God. And so Luke and Acts is this big picture thing where Luke tells us, yeah, I researched this, but I also lived it. And he'll tell us that. And John's focus then, when we look at that, is going to be, again, always about telling you how these things are substantially going to build your faith, that you may believe. We often note that when we're reading the scriptures in a sense of, I need information about God. Every time we do that in our Bible, we're doing theology. We are all theologians. The question is, do we want to become good theologians? And so all of us, when we take one passage and another passage and rub them side by side and say, what kind of fire does this create? That's theology. That's all that is. Good theologians pay attention to that when they also say, hey, what else is going on? What's the history? What's the circumstances? What's the place? What's the event? Why did God choose to say this thing here to these people there? And what does that mean to me? And by the way, you've done this over the entire course of your lives. You do this every time you read your Bible. Sometimes we just don't pay a close attention to it. And so when you read the Bible and it says, God says for me to do this, that's theology, but we also say God said for them to do that. But it doesn't apply to me. That's also theology in the same space. Much in the same way you might go back and read Jeremiah 29 and you say, well, it says for God has plans for them, for me, and we make sure that's for them. My plans might be a different set of instructions than what Jeremiah said to people long, long ago. So, geography here, as it's going to influence us. We're paying attention to what's going on, and we're seeing some things happen up where Jesus told his disciples that he must suffer and die, and he did so in the center space around Jerusalem as we're leading up to a high emphasis part of the life of Jesus. A large part of the Gospel of Matthew is actually spent on a few weeks. Some of it is spent on the few weeks of his birth and the narratives that follow that. And a large chunk of it is spent on 1 week of his life toward the end. And so when we start getting to the latter part of the gospel, realize that we've focused in on a smaller and smaller period of time that's going to change the way we see things. And we find Peter being identified here as a part of our teaching space in chapter 17 and verse 24, where he is going to learn something that for the most part is a generally unified opinion space for all people. I haven't actually met very many people who would ever say, you know what, I really like paying my taxes. I'm sure that, well, let me back that up. I was kind of excited to pay taxes a little bit my first couple paychecks until I started doing the math about it. Because I was getting paid. I was like, I got a paycheck. What's all this over here? Oh, that's kind of interesting. I'm like, oh, that's not as interesting as it once was. It fades. That excitement of, hey, you know, I got all this stuff going on kind of reduces. But do you guys remember where that happened? What area, space that's going on in? Yeah, so it's out in our little coaster space in Capernaum. I got the answer up there. And that's actually near his home space when that takes place. It's an area near his upbringing. And it's known and notable for fishing, for being a fishing community. There's 3 types of Israelite industry of large amounts in the whole region, both above and below Jerusalem. You have those who are shepherds. They are there doing all the things that you would think a shepherd would do, moving their flocks around. Some of those shepherds had actually moved into pig farming, which was a large industry in Israel around the time of Christ. Ironic, because the Israelites wouldn't have anything to do with pigs in many ways. But it's a massive industry. That's why there are swine present in the Bible story. And it's actually only in Israel for about 100 years as a major part of its economy. It's just right around the time of Jesus is the time in which pig farming is a big deal in Israel. So you've got that herding, shepherding space. You have fishing. And you have those who would engage in agriculture. But remember, this is not traditional farming in the sense that we're used to it. Agricultural activity in Israel is gathering from the orchards, gathering from trees more than it is planting crops. Because really, it's only up near Galilee where the water table system is sufficient for that to take place. And that's also the poorest part of Israel at this time. And so that shifts our perspective a little bit as well there. So Jesus departed from Galilee and goes to Judea beyond the Jordan. You'll notice that this whole area here is kind of highlighted for us to pay attention to. There's a couple of key places that are important for us. One of them being Bethany beyond the Jordan. It is one of the various spots, and maybe Rich noted this before, that is a alternative site to where Jesus may have been baptized. There are three major possibilities that we make note of when we think about the baptism of Jesus. This is the third least likely of them. Tradition kind of shapes our understanding of where these places take place. So, on the way to Jerusalem, this is looking forward a little bit, Jesus heals two blind men. This takes place in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 20. Do you guys know offhand, before I show you the answer, where that may have taken place, where Jesus healed two blind people? Super popular biblical city. It makes its appearance in our primary narratives of the place of Israel in the conquest. A couple of big stories take place there. Jericho would be our location. Jericho, because of where it's situated in line with trade routes, is just where all stuff happens. And so I've got a little side note that I put in one of my notes a long time ago, that Jericho is basically a Waffle House. Now here's why it's basically a Waffle House. If you go to modern history, what happens at Waffle Houses? Everyone goes there to eat, and it's a city of palms to a certain degree.
Main traveled routes.
Main traveled routes. The only thing that causes a Waffle House to close is a massive act of God, right? And it has to be like the biggest of the big. And so in the Bible stories, how often does Jericho close in the biblical stories? And who does the closing of it? God knocks those walls down. Now, historically, there was actually 22 different conquests of Jericho, maybe 23, where it was flattened and rebuilt. But from the perspective of remembering it, that's what happens. And also, at Jericho, at the Waffle House, everybody be fighting. If there's going to be a fight break out at 2 a.m., it happened at the Waffle House. So Jericho also fits for that. And so there's a good way to kind of, and by the way, I do this a lot. I tie biblical narratives and literature to things that match in our modern culture, so I will remember them. And maybe y'all will too. And so this is a way to kind of key these pieces together. Independent, if that's the way you want to do it or not, that's how I do it to remember things. A lot of that goes on. And so that takes place at Jericho. It also helps us understand the spiritual culture that Jesus is interacting with. Jericho is not heavily spiritually focused like you would expect Jerusalem to be. This is an outlier space. In between Jericho and Jerusalem is where you would find a pretty desolate place where the Essenes would take up their status spot and say, this is where we're going to be. That's important to us because in that middle space, and the Essenes building that community, they leave us a legacy of literature that is unparalleled in biblical value. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls come from. And that community, not in Jericho where they have more trade and activity, not in Jerusalem where they are perceived as being super spiritual, was highly focused on making sure they kept their understanding of the Jewish lifestyle and religious practices right. And they did that to their best of their ability until they were absolutely slaughtered by the Roman Empire at the end of the Second Temple period. But they hid all their literature in the caves, in small clay vessels, and a lot of it was surviving to forward times. Much of it, though, was also destroyed by the Romans when they found it. They found some of it over the years. Jesus rides in to rides a donkey from where to where, and he rides from or near the Mount of Olives into Bethlehem. It's not a difficult route to go that route there. The pathway itself, especially even through antiquity into modern days, isn't hard. There's some elevation change, but it's not a big difficult thing. So this is not he got on the donkey because the journey was hard. The donkey is representative for him. Do we necessarily think that riding a donkey is a sign of status? What in modern context do you think is a sign of status for us? If someone came into town and we wanted to show them that they are the most important people who would ever come to Coweta County, what are some of the ways we would accomplish that task?
Bring in a limo.
Limo. What else we might do?
I said stretch limo.
Stretch limo. We would probably block off the roads. Put a big parade, perhaps. This matches the imagery that Jesus experiences as he begins to make his way toward Jerusalem. Yes, he rides a donkey, which to them represented both status and for us is fulfillment, because it was promised that he would do so. But then you see them laying out palms. That's red carpet treatment. That's not done for the average ordinary person. This is also a tie-in that crosses the cultures a little bit, because some of these practices don't just exist in Israelite biblical history. They actually are found in the triumphal parades of the Roman forces. And remember, there's a double message in paying attention to these, and Paul uses this imagery in the letters to the churches. There's a double image there. So we tend to think of a triumphal parade as being one of victory. Remember that for the Roman perspective, and this kind of shows up in how Mark approaches this, being included in the Roman parade doesn't happen for the non-Roman. If you're included, you're there as a captive, and it's seen as a sense of shame. You are basically held captive, and that's kind of where Paul goes a bit with his writing. Remember, Jesus is going into Jerusalem in these incremental steps as both a victor and a sacrifice. And so we have to pay attention to those two parts of it that show up in the historical side and the geographic side as he's making this. He's coming in as a sacrifice. So as much as he is king, he is also lamb. And so both of those images will appear. Both of those things will touch on the history. Both of those things are going to be kind of interplayed together. Where did they ascribe Jesus' prophetic status to? He was a prophet from... Remember, most of the prophets are regionalized in the history of Israel. They have a place they're from. John, if you remember, does his prophetic work on the southern section of Israel. He's a prophet out in the wilderness of Judea. And so where was Jesus from his Israelite perspective?
Galilee.
Galilee and Nazareth. And remember, Saying you're from Nazareth means to say that in any other place, you're saying that person is from the lowest part of culture. So if you were born and raised in Pleasanton, California, and you attended Foothill High School, if you wanted to say you were from the lowest part of the community, you would say, oh, I guess you're from Amador, which is the crosstown high school from us. And so if you're one of the Amador Dons, you're not worth much at all. But it's where the Falcons are at, that's where the high point is. And so we all have this counter perspective in our minds that we already know and are accustomed to. That's what's going on here. Jesus is a prophet from nowhere. A prophet from no place. A prophet from no status. Culturally and historically, that's how he would be seen, especially as he's making his way up into the hoity-toity areas around Jerusalem. In the new expanded Herod the Great Builder's expanded temple. Massive stone staircases that would go up into that plateau. How grand it is. Who's this Jesus fella from nowhere town? That's part of that imagery that comes into play and helps us appreciate and understand what's going on with his message. And so he would have been a prophet from the hinterlands, the other spaces. When he is getting in the incremental steps that go to his eventual series of trials and physical consequences of that event, where does he spend that first night as he goes into it? It's found in Matthew 21, verse 7, or 17, that is. Right before that, he's in Bethany. Bethany is a community on the edge of it. And so, first night of that last week, Bethany. Bethany is what surrounds and kind of catches up to the Mount of Olives, which houses the Garden of Gethsemane. And so we're seeing these layered terms, layered names appear, much like Bullsboro is also Highway 34. And sometimes eventually Bullsboro turns into, the edge of it becomes like 54-ish when it connects to 74. That's how the map works in my brain. The map doesn't actually work that way. I apologize for my lack of modern mapping skills. And most of this is probably familiar to us from other biblical literature. But Jesus, from that point in time, as Matthew records, announces that this is the city that kills prophets. Which of the prophets did you not? Or you might connect it this way and think about it in terms of how John would later write in the text of Revelation that the city's stones cry out because of the blood of first the prophets, but also the Lamb. And so here's a catch for you. If a prophet from outside of the hoity-toity elevated society of Jerusalem is saying, this is where prophets die, and he's a prophet, would that be a clue for Sherlock Holmes to pay attention to do and say, hey, there's something going on here. Why is Jesus talking about prophets dying? And he's a prophet. Because prophet, priest, and king is one of the ways we think about his title space. And the reason I ask that question is the disciples struggle to process this information. They don't uniformly kind of get there at the same pace where they understand who Jesus is. Peter, who I think most of us probably at times have a temporary or maybe even a more permanent affiliation to, and say, hey, I get where he's coming from. Peter clearly doesn't see it as a good thing for Jesus to die. And he pays no attention to the prophets die in Jerusalem narrative that's being played out here. Because that is a very common thing. And the people of Jerusalem kill their own prophets on a regular, consistent basis in the biblical narrative. We feel the same way at times. We don't want things to happen, even though when God is telling us, this is exactly how it goes. This is the progress and the process that it works through. And then we get to what some of you already mentioned before, where Jesus starts talking about the temple narratives. And we'll see this when we pay attention to the book of Acts a couple different ways, and we've seen it in other courses. When Jesus is making this prediction from the Mount of Olives, or Mount Olivet, near or at the Garden of Gethsemane in that physical spot, I want you to imagine that this little ledge here is kind of where he's standing. And so Jesus could be positioned here for our perspective this way. And there's just a small little dip in the ground that goes down and that comes back up. And so nearly every picture you see of someone showing you modern terms, the Temple Mount area. You know, when you see that photo of the Dome of the Rock in the background and you see Jerusalem laid out before you, it's essentially all along this line that Jesus could be standing on in this Mount Olivet area looking at the temple. So every one of those images you've seen in your books forever, that's about where Jesus could have been standing. Now, modern context, we see it this way. Nearly everything below your feet are all tombs. They are all graves in that image. There are tombs of Israelites when the hill goes down, and when the hill goes up, they are Muslim tombs. Historically, that's happening because even Israelites who have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah are still waiting for the messianic event to take place, and they want to be there when that happens next to the temple. That's why they are there. And the Muslim tombs that are on the other side, they were planted there intentionally to keep the Israelites, the Jewish folks, off of that section, because now that is defiled ground. And it means that they cannot be there in order to maintain their holiness. All of them, though, are put in this spot where Jesus historically stood on the way to his own burial, which would have taken place probably a quarter mile from there on the old outskirts of the city. And he makes a destruction picture about the temple. Now, a couple things have happened. This helps us understand what's going on. It has taken a long time to get that temple to where it is. So the first thing that happened is the gradual three-step return of captivity that takes place when the captives come back from Mesopotamia and beyond, and they slowly rebuild the temple. And at the closure of that section of the 12 or the minor prophets, they rebuild the temple. It's an authentic, functioning temple, but they weep because it is not as grand as it once was, right? We remember that part of the Bible story. Well, now we've gone forward probably 500-ish years from that part of the cycle of the story of the history of Israel. And the one Herod that does all the building, Great Herod the Great, has spent a lot of money making it bigger. A long time goes into expanding that platform out. And so that's what everyone who is living knows. It has taken forever to build this. And so when Jesus makes a prophecy concerning the destruction of the temple, twofold message, his temple, that temple, it seems implausible. How could that happen? There's no way that that could happen. Because in all my life, nothing like that has ever happened. How many of your choices in your life function exactly like that? I've never experienced it, so there's no way it could happen. That's pretty all of us. To some degree or another, we kind of move and feel that way. That I've never had it happen to me, so there's no way that that could happen. Nobody ever pulls anybody over for going 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, so I can go 5 miles per hour over the speed limit until they do. And there are parts of I-75 on the southern side of the state that if you go too fast, you are there to provide cash to the local county. And you will 1,000% be pulled over independent of what you feel. right? And so we know that those are realities. There's a level of awe. I've never experienced it. But wait a minute. Didn't these disciples see Jesus do wild things? The close 12 and the others around them had already seen things like the raising of the dead, Jesus miraculously escaping captivity, other levels of the display of the power of God. They'd seen the casting out of demons. They'd been involved in the spreading of the gospel with the 70 in various ways, the good news of the kingdom. They, to a certain degree, would have been aware of God speaking from heaven. They would have known of the history of Israel and the power of the prophets. And even if they didn't fully understand what it meant to be a Messiah, they knew that Jesus was at least a prophet. And yet they still, and everyone around him, what are you talking about? Destroy the temple and rebuild it? What, this whole temple? That doesn't make any sense to me. Especially when it's in view and they can think about it. The point that I always catch here for myself, I made a note about this probably 15 years ago, is that we are easily distracted by what we see instead of what we should be listening to. They see that temple that can't be rebuilt, couldn't be torn down, and completely miss the message. They completely miss what would have been incredibly important for them. Could you imagine if you were the doctor of theory, and like maybe hanging out with Sherlock Holmes, and you're Dr. Watson, and you put it together before Sherlock revealed the clue for you, and you're at the cross, and you're like, wait a minute, I know he's going to die, but I'm pretty sure he said he's coming back. So all I got to do is chill out. Give me a week. This will all sort itself out. That's everybody in humanity. We all make that same mistake where we see what's in front of us instead of listening to what should be important for us. We also catch and pay attention to this story, the city in which the foot washing cycle takes place. This is a normal cultural thing, by the way, to wash feet. It is not for us. We are super uncomfortable with it for all kinds of reasons. Partly because our culture doesn't have the setting and place of a experience there. We wear shoes. We scrape our feet before I come in. And at most you're going to hear in your typical household we're used to, shoes off at the door. Leave those things there. Wash your hands. Like that's the extent of entry information. This is not exclusively a thing that is done because of dirt and germs. This is good host behavior. This is what should take place with a good host. But this is a care being extended, and there's a status issue here. In the culture of the first century, washing somebody's feet is done by the lowest to the highest in the sense of their perceived rank. That this should take place where whoever is the highest in the house should have their feet washed as a sign of respect. Independent of, well, they're wearing sandals and their feet are dirty. Everybody's feet are dirty. They're going to get dirty once again the minute they put those sandals back in and walk back outside. But this shows the respect and care for them. This means you actually value them. And so that helps us also then understand the narrative that takes place with the washing of the feet and the anointing of the feet and the cost. It also carries into our picture of Jesus as Lamb. Kings got their feet washed. The Lamb is now being prepared for sacrifice in the same kind of pictorial event there. And after our Passover meal, where's our next spot for Jesus? So they observed the Passover that was prepared for them by both miraculous and intentional activity on the Lord's hand. Where do they go next? Gethsemane is our next spot. And if you want to catch an interplay, at the time when the disciples should be taking a nap, they don't. That's back on the ship, where they're crossing over, and everything should be fine, and they should just totally be chill. And they're all freaked out and nervous and cannot sleep. And now, at the time when they should not be taking a nap, and they should be concerned and heavily focused in prayer, what do the disciples do in Gethsemane? They pop up those hammocks and they take a nap for the first time when they should not have. Now, they committed to not do so. They made the commitment, oh no, yes, I will absolutely. This begins a series of drop-offs in commitment for these close disciples in ways that are sometimes made unique to just Peter, but he's not the only one. He's not the only individual who sees their commitment to the tasks in front of them incrementally diminish. Even though when the fighting comes on, he's ready with that sword. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to fight. They're not catching that the battle that they are engaged in is not the battle that matters. They think it's a physical one. Jesus is drawing them into the spiritual one. Where does Jesus say he's going to see them next? This occurs in Matthew 26 and verse 32, by the way. Yeah, Galilee. And so Galilee is our next, step in the story, and it's a circle. He's a prophet from Galilee. He's a prophet from Nazareth. He's a prophet from these upper lands. They're not always putting together the pieces, and they have no clue on how that happens. Like, how does he get up there? Let's hear it. But he's already proven to them, to a certain degree, that he's not necessarily working on the same schedule system they're on. He doesn't travel in the same pathways that they're accustomed to. So there's some of this that takes place. This also puts him back in the region and spots as part of our circle. On the top part of our circle up here, the region of Galilee, is the location where in Mark's account it takes place almost right in the middle of the text around Mark chapter 9, where Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem. And that begins the shift thematically and in language, where Jesus is now really heavily focused on his messianic role. And so he's cycling them back and saying, and then I'll be back with you in Galilee again. I will return and I will see you in this way. What about this guy named Simon? Where's he from? He shows up in the biblical text in chapter 27, and he has a really awful job. Simon from Cyrene. Wrong place, wrong time illustration, right? How many of you just wandering around would be so happy to find out, hey, you're a big guy. Would you please carry this big beam for me? Because this guy can't carry it anymore. I would rather not be involved in this execution, independent of whether I think the individual is guilty or not. As a general rule, I don't like to go to places where people are being killed. Like, that's like on a list of things. Like, doesn't seem like a good choice. Pressed into service. It presents to us a picture that at times, and we'll see this when we go back to it in different ways when we start examining the text, that is a slightly more complicated and nuanced story. Our individual is an outsider helping another outsider who's going to save all the outsiders. It's just one way to think through this geographical spot. And then he's taken to a location, and there's a couple of names for it. We lean into the Latin name. That's the one you're probably most familiar with. It's coming a bit from the Greek origin of it. And it starts with the letter G. Golgotha. That sounds pretty significant, right? Don't draw into it so much as a visual that it's looking like a skull in the sense of the face of it. You see that sometimes, where people say, this is where they found it. And there is a place in Jerusalem There's two of them outside of the city, modern city, that they think, people say often, well, this had to have been it, because the rock formation looks like the front face of a skull. Well, that's not it. That's not the location. It's too far out from the biblical story as the way it's laid out. It's called the place of the skull in part because of its shape from the top side. It looks like the dome of your noggin. And so if you want to see what the shape of the skull looks like, just go look in the mirror and pull your hair back. That's kind of what that little place of rock is. And that rock formation is actually housed inside a triple-owned church space that has and goes back through a long time as Jerusalem grew outward from its city walls. It's inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which that's what it's referred to and called in English. And inside of that, it houses the location for where they suspect that is the rock and the stone where he would have been crucified. And nearby, down and a little bit into the caving system, is a good likely location for his grave site. And both of those are now built over by churches. And we'll look at those pictures again when we go back, probably even next Sunday, and pay attention to this. This Golgotha, this place of the skull, was just outside the city gates, just outside the edge of the old city of Jerusalem. The Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, can be walked in very short order from the Garden of Gethsemane all the way out to the place of the skull without much effort. And that's the route that Jesus goes in and on these initial couple of days. We're going to pause right here. There's a few more aspects we'll pay attention to next Sunday morning. We're pausing here because the clock is just about to signal the end of class time. If you've got extra questions, please come up and talk to me afterwards. But I'm looking forward to continuing the study and examination next Sunday morning.